The frost came early to Montana that year. It settled over the ranch like a judgment, quiet, thorough, and without apology. By the middle of October, the grass along the east fence had gone the color of old straw, and the cottonwoods that lined the creek stood bare against a sky, the particular shade of gray that promised nothing good. The land was still beautiful, the way abandoned things sometimes are, wide and open and indifferent to the troubles of the man who walked across it every morning before the sun had fully risen. He rose before dawn out of habit, not hope. There had been a time, not so long ago, though it felt like another life entirely, when the ranch had stirred with purpose at this hour, when the smell of wood smoke and coffee drifted from the main house, and the yard held the satisfying noise of a place that was going somewhere. That time had passed, the way certain seasons pass, gradually at first, then all at once, until one morning a man looks up from his work and realizes the going somewhere has stopped, and he cannot say exactly when. He pulled on his coat in the dark and went out. The yard was quiet. The 4 remaining hands slept in the bunkhouse. Good men, patient men, men who had stayed on past the point where staying made obvious sense. He was aware of what he owed them. He was aware of it the way a man is aware of a stone in his boot, constantly and without relief. He walked the fence line first, as he always did. 2 rails needed replacing along the north pasture. They had needed it since August, and he had not replaced them, not for lack of ability, for lack of something harder to name, the will, perhaps, to pour effort into a place that seemed determined to return everything he gave it with diminishing results. The cattle were fewer than last year, the feed stores were lower, the root cellar held enough to see the house through the cold months. Barely, but there would be no ease to this winter, no margin for generosity, no supper that looked like abundance. He stopped at the edge of the yard and looked back at the buildings laid out before him in the thin gray light. The main house, its paint faded to a color that might once have been white. The bunkhouse, its stovepipe trailing a thin thread of smoke. The barn, solid enough, honest in its plainness, and at the far corner of the yard, half hidden behind the old wagon shed, the smokehouse, small, weathered, its door swollen shut with 2 winters of disuse. He had not opened that door in longer than he cared to remember. There was nothing in it worth opening for. He stood there a moment longer than necessary, his breath clouding in the cold air, his hands quiet at his sides. Then he turned back toward the house, because a man with nothing left to expect still has a morning to get through, and getting through was what he knew how to do. She arrived the way most honest things arrive, without announcement, without fanfare, in the plain middle of an ordinary morning. He was coming down from the upper pasture when he saw her at the gate, a small figure standing with the patience of someone who had learned not to expect doors to open quickly. She carried a single bundle, wrapped in brown cloth and held against her side with the practiced ease of a person who had carried it a long way and intended to carry it further still. She wore a plain wool shawl over her coat, the color of winter wheat, and she stood straight in the cold air, as though the cold were simply a fact she had already made her peace with. He came through the gate without hurrying, sized her up in the way a man sizes up a horse or a length of fence, not unkindly, but without sentiment. She was younger than he had expected. The letter from the agency in Billings had said, "Experienced in domestic work and willing to take on all tasks." He had read, "all tasks," and thought, good. He had work that no one else wanted. She met his eyes when he reached her. That surprised him slightly. Most people hired on for seasonal work arrived with their gaze aimed at the ground, studying the cost of what they were about to agree to. She did not look at the ground. She looked at him with a steady, quiet attention, as though she were also taking a measure of something. He told her the terms in a few short sentences. Room in the house, meals when there were meals to be had, a small wage at the end of the month if the month went well. He did not soften any of it. She listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she gave a single nod, the kind that means she understood rather than agreed with. He took her through the yard and showed her the house, the bunkhouse, the well. He pointed out the barn and named the men she would be working alongside without introducing her to any of them by name. He was not a man who saw much use in ceremony. Then he stopped at the edge of the yard, near the wagon shed, and pointed toward the small outbuilding hunched in the far corner, the smokehouse. Its door was swollen shut, its roof furred with old moss, its single window opaque with years of grime. It looked like something that had given up. He told her to clean it out, clear the dust, check for rot, make it usable again, or at least determine what was left of it. He did not expect much. He expected exactly what the place looked like, empty and past its usefulness. She looked at the smokehouse for a moment with that same steady gaze she had turned on him at the gate. She did not say it looked hopeless. She did not say anything at all. She simply picked up her bundle, adjusted her shawl against the bite of the morning air, and started walking toward it. The door did not open so much as surrender. She had to set her bundle down, brace one hand against the frame, and lean her shoulder into the warped wood before it finally gave, not with a crack, but with a long, low groan, as though the building itself had forgotten how to let anyone in. Cold air spilled out around her, stale and dark and carrying the particular ghost of things that had once been useful. She picked up her lantern, stepped over the threshold, and waited for her eyes to adjust. What she saw was not emptiness exactly. It was the aftermath of it. Emptiness suggests a clean slate, a room waiting for purpose. This was something older and sadder, a place that had held purpose once, and then watched it depart without ceremony. The walls were dark with years of old smoke, stained deep as walnut, and where the light caught them, they had the look of cured leather, weathered past any memory of softness. Cobwebs draped the corners in long, patient curtains. Dust lay thick on the single plank shelf running along the left wall, and on the two heavy barrels pushed against the far end, and on the iron hooks overhead where things had once hung and no longer did. She lifted the lantern higher and turned slowly, looking at all of it without hurry. The smell was something she could not quite name, part wood smoke and part cold earth, and part time itself, the way very old rooms carry the compressed weight of seasons inside them, invisible as memory, present as stone. There was no rot she could see, no collapsed beams, no broken boards. The place had been abandoned, not ruined. There was a difference. She stood with that thought for a moment. She was not a woman who encountered neglect with despair. She had seen too much of both to confuse them. What she felt instead, standing in that low-ceilinged dark with her lantern making a small, warm circle around her feet, was something more deliberate, a kind of careful attention, the same attention a person gives a letter whose handwriting they do not yet recognize, before they have decided whether to open it or set it aside. She began along the left wall, moving methodically. She tested the shelf with one hand, solid. She checked the planks underfoot. No softness, no give. She ran her thumb along a hook overhead and found the iron still true and firm in its timber. Each small discovery was filed quietly away. She was building a picture, and she did not rush the building of it. When she reached the barrels, she set the lantern on the ground, crouched beside the first one, and pushed it, heavy, not empty. She stilled. She pushed it again, more deliberately, until it rolled a few inches to the side, and in the space behind it, in the shadow the lantern had not yet reached, something caught the edge of the light, a shape, low and cloth-wrapped and larger than she had expected. She reached for it. The cloth was rough beneath her fingers, coarse weave, the kind used for wrapping things meant to last. She did not pull it free all at once. She worked at the corner, turning back one fold, then another, with the same careful patience she had given the rest of the room. The lantern light pooled yellow and warm across her hands as she worked. and when the first edge of the thing beneath came into view, she stopped. She knew what she was looking at before she had fully unwrapped it. The smell reached her first, deep and smoky and salt-cured, the particular smell of patience, of time deliberately spent. She had grown up with that smell in smaller houses, on leaner winters, when such a thing sitting in the cold was the difference between a table set and a table bare. She knew its meaning the way she knew the meaning of a full woodpile or a mended roof. Not comfort exactly, closer to dignity. She pulled the cloth back another inch, and there it was, a ham, large and perfectly formed, the surface darkened to a deep mahogany, the cloth around it clean and dry and free of mold. Someone had wrapped this with care. Someone had done the work properly and then, somehow, had simply forgotten where the work had been left. She sat back on her heels. The lantern went on burning steadily. Outside, the wind moved against the smokehouse boards and found no way in. She did not call out. She did not stand up and carry the thing immediately to the door to show anyone who might be passing. She simply stayed where she was, crouched in the low shadow behind 2 old barrels, with a ham in her hands large enough to feed 5 men a proper supper, and she let herself think. She thought about the rancher's face that morning, the particular flatness of it, the way a man's expression goes when pride has been pressed down so long it no longer rises. She thought about the cook's thin silence and the hands eating without speaking, and the sense the whole place gave, even in its best light, of something running quietly down. She thought about the table in the main house, which was long enough for 10 and set each evening for 5, and how a long table with too few plates at it is one of the loneliest sights the world offers. And she thought about what this meant, not in grand terms, not in rescued fortunes or reversed fates, but in the plain immediate language of a cold night and a hungry crew and a man who had forgotten, or perhaps stopped believing, that the place still had anything left in it. It had something left in it. She held the ham across both arms, feeling its weight, which was considerable, real, undeniable. The kind of thing that, once brought into the light, could not be argued with. She rewrapped the corner of cloth. She reached for the lantern, and then she rose, slowly, with the particular steadiness of a woman who has already decided what she is going to do next. The cold met her at the smokehouse door, like a wall she had to push through, and she pushed through it. The ranch yard was quiet in the particular way late afternoons go quiet in Montana. Not peaceful exactly, but suspended, as though the sky and the frozen ground had reached a temporary agreement to hold still. Her breath came in short white clouds. The ham was heavy across both arms, wrapped in its old cloth like something being carried to a ceremony, and she walked steadily, neither hurrying nor dawdling, across the hard earth toward the kitchen door. She heard them before she reached it. 2 of the hands were somewhere near the barn, speaking in the low, flat tones men use when they have stopped expecting anything to change. A third was sitting on the bunkhouse step, hat pulled down, whittling at nothing in particular. The 4th was coming around the corner of the main house, with his collar turned up and his shoulders drawn in against the wind. She did not look away from any of them, and she did not try to hide what she was carrying. The one coming around the corner saw her first. He stopped walking. She kept walking. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, with the careful voice of a man who is not yet willing to believe what his eyes are showing him, "What is that?" It was not quite a question. She answered it anyway. "Ham," she said, "from the smokehouse." The word smokehouse landed strangely in the cold air. She could see him turning it over, locating the building in his memory, trying to reconcile it with what she held. By the time she reached the kitchen door, all 4 of them had drifted toward her, with the involuntary gravity of men drawn to something they have not dared hope for. The cook looked up when she came in. He was a spare, weathered man who had long since learned to manage silence the way other men manage conversation, efficiently, without waste. When he saw the ham, The silence in him shifted into something else entirely. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps. He stood before her and looked at what she held the way an old man looks at a letter he thought would never come. Then he took it from her, gently, with both hands, and set it on the wide wooden table. The kitchen changed almost immediately. The hands had followed her inside without invitation, and no one told them to leave. The cook unwrapped the cloth, and his hands moved with a certainty they had not had in months, reaching for the pot, the salt block, the knife that hung near the stove. The fire, which had been burning low all afternoon, was suddenly given more purpose. Wood was added without being asked for. The smell began before the first cut was made. Deep, cured, unmistakable, the smell of a kitchen that means to feed people tonight. One of the hands sat down at the table without a word. Then another, the third stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching the cook work, and the expression on his face was one that had no name but was nonetheless entirely clear. He had been in the far room when the smell reached him. Not a sharp smell, not the kind that demands attention all at once. It was slower than that, the way warmth moves through a cold house, finding its way under doors and around corners, gentle and persistent, asking nothing but noticed all the same. He had been standing at the window, looking out at the yard, the way a man looks at something he can no longer fully claim, when the air in the room changed. He turned from the window without quite knowing why. He followed it the way you follow a sound you are not certain you heard, carefully, half unwilling, afraid that certainty might be worse than doubt. He reached the kitchen doorway and stopped. The room before him was not the room he had left that morning. The fire was high and deliberate. The cook moved with his back straight, his hands occupied, his whole body carrying the particular confidence of a man who has been given something to work with. The smell was everywhere now, warm and deep and entirely real. The smell of meat curing properly, of a kitchen doing what a kitchen is supposed to do. On the wide table sat the ham, unwrapped, substantial, waiting with a kind of quiet authority. And his men were there, all 4 of them, inside his kitchen, in the early evening, which was not a thing that had happened in a very long time. One sat at the far end of the table with his hat still on, leaning forward slightly, watching the cook the way a man watches something he does not want to look away from. 2 more stood near the wall, not speaking, but present in the full sense of the word, present in a way that meant they intended to be. The 4th remained in the doorway just ahead of him, arms folded, and the line of his shoulders had lost the particular tension it had been carrying for weeks. He took all of this in. He did not move. Then he saw her. She was standing at the side of the room, not in the center of it, not making any claim to the attention that was plainly hers. She had set her lantern down on the shelf near the door, and she stood with her shawl around her shoulders and her hands quiet at her sides, watching the cook work with the same careful expression she seemed to carry everywhere with her, as though the world were a thing worth observing closely before drawing any conclusions about it. She had not noticed him yet. Or perhaps she had, and was simply giving him the grace of a moment to find himself before she looked. He stood in the doorway of his own kitchen and looked at the ham on his table and the men it had gathered and the fire burning with purpose, and he understood, without any particular comfort, that none of it had come from him. Not the discovery, not the warmth, not the shift in the air that had made this cold house feel, for the first time, in longer than he cared to count, like something worth returning to. He moved away from the doorway before she could turn and find him standing there, like a man caught at something he could not explain. He crossed to the far end of the table and pulled out the chair he always took, the one with its back to the window, the one that had been his since the first winter he built this place, and he sat down without ceremony, as though nothing about the evening was unusual, as though he had expected all of it. The cook set the ham at the center of the table on the old wooden board they used for everything, and the smell of it moved through the room like something alive. Salt and smoke and the deep, patient sweetness of meat cured the right way. by someone who had known what they were doing. The ranch hands settled into their chairs with the particular quiet of men who did not want to break a spell. No one spoke, no one reached. They simply sat for a moment and looked at the board, and something in the set of their shoulders, something in the way their chins lifted, changed. The cook sliced, and supper began. The sound of it was ordinary and remarkable at once. The scrape of a knife, the soft knock of a ladle. Bread passed hand to hand without asking. The fire in the stove did not roar. It settled, the way fires do when they have found their purpose. The lamp on the table threw its light in a wide circle, and every face caught it differently. One man's jaw working slowly, one man's eyes closed for just a moment after the first bite, as though he were remembering what it felt like to be fed properly. She sat at the far end of the bench, where the hired help always sat when they were invited at all. She had kept her shawl across her shoulders. She ate without hurry, without comment, with the same attentiveness she seemed to bring to everything. She did not look to see whether she was being noticed. She did not angle for acknowledgement. She simply ate and listened, and now and then her gaze moved across the table with a kind of quiet arithmetic, reading the room the way she had read the Smokehouse, looking for what was there rather than what was missing. He watched her twice. The first time, she was reaching past the man beside her to set the bread back on its cloth, and the motion was so unhurried it seemed to slow the room around it. The second time, she was looking at nothing in particular, at the grain of the table, or at the middle distance, and her expression was not quite a smile, but it carried the shape of one, as if something in the sound of the room, the eating and the quiet, had satisfied something she had not known she was waiting for. He looked away before she could look back. He did not know why, only that some recognitions, once made, are not easily undone. The hands did not push back from the table the way men do when they are only finished. They pushed back the way men do when they are reluctant to be finished. There is a difference, and the ranch had not seen the second kind in longer than any of them would have admitted. One of the older hands, a weathered man who spoke little and observed much, turned his tin cup slowly in his hands and said nothing for a moment. Then he refilled it from the pot that had been set at the center of the table and settled back into his chair with the particular ease of a man who has nowhere pressing to be and, for once, does not mind. Across from him, two of the younger hands had found their way into some low, unhurried conversation. Nothing remarkable, only the ordinary talk of men who have eaten well and feel, however briefly, that the world is in reasonable order. A joke was made, quietly enough that not everyone caught it. What everyone caught was the sound that followed it. Laughter, soft and unguarded, the kind that does not announce itself. The woman had moved to clear the far end of the table. She worked without intrusion, gathering quietly, leaving the conversation undisturbed, the way a good fire leaves a room undisturbed, present, useful, not demanding to be remarked upon. It was the older hand who finally said it. He said it simply, with no particular emphasis, as a man states something he has turned over long enough to be certain of. He said the place did not feel finished anymore. He did not elaborate. He did not look at anyone when he said it. He was looking at his cup, or at the middle distance beyond the lamp's reach, and the words came out the way such words often do, not as announcement but as recognition, the kind that has been waiting quietly for the right moment to be spoken aloud. The younger hands did not respond directly, but something settled among them, a slight easing, a faint adjustment in the shoulders, the way men lean back a degree further when something true has been said, and they feel no need to dispute it. The rancher stood near the head of the table. He had not sat again after the supper was served. He was not sure why. He had the sense that sitting would have required something of him he was not yet prepared to give, some concession to ease he had not yet decided he had earned. He heard what the older hand said. He did not respond. He turned his gaze briefly toward the window, where the last of the evening had gone entirely dark, and the glass held only the reflection of the lamp and the blurred shapes of the men around the table. Something shifted in him. Not a breaking, not a turning. Something quieter than either, the way ice shifts at the end of winter when nothing has visibly changed and yet everything beneath has begun, very slowly, to move. He said nothing yet, but he heard it. He heard all of it. The men finished slowly, the way men do when they are trying to make something last. Chairs scraped back one by one. Someone set a tin cup down too hard. Not with anger, but with the loose carelessness of a man who has finally exhaled. They filed out into the dark, murmuring among themselves, their boots crossing the porch boards and fading toward the bunkhouse. She began to clear the table. It was the same work she had done all evening, quiet and unhurried, her hands moving among the plates and cups with the ease of someone who has never expected to be watched while she worked. She carried the first load out through the back door, into the cold. The night had settled hard and clear. The sky was enormous overhead, thick with stars, and the air had the particular sharpness of late autumn in that country, the kind of cold that does not threaten yet, but carries the warning of what is coming. She set the things down on the wide, flat step and straightened, pulling her shawl tighter. She did not hear him follow. She only became aware of him when the door settled closed and his boots sounded once on the boards behind her, and then went quiet. He stood a little apart from her in the dark, not close enough to impose, not far enough to suggest indifference. He was looking out toward the yard, toward the shape of the smokehouse at its far edge, its door still open, the latch catching a faint gleam from somewhere. Moonlight or starlight, she could not be certain. A long moment passed. It was not uncomfortable. That was the strange thing. It was simply still. Then he said, without quite looking at her, "Where did you come from?" It was not the question an employer asks when he means to verify something. The tone was different, quieter. It had no authority in it. It was the question of a man who has realized, belatedly, that he knows almost nothing about the person standing beside him, and has begun to find that remarkable. She glanced at him briefly, then back toward the dark. "East of here," she said. "A good way east." He nodded, as though this answered something. Another pause. The cold moved between them without urgency. "You knew what you were looking for," he said. "In the smokehouse. You knew how to recognize the ham hadn't gone bad." It was not quite a compliment. It was not quite a question. It was the particular way a man speaks when he is circling something he does not yet know how to say directly, testing the ground one careful step at a time. She was quiet for a moment. "I knew what a smokehouse was supposed to smell like," she said. "I knew what it meant when it didn't." He turned then, just slightly, and looked at her. She did not make it into a story worth telling. That was the first thing he noticed. Most people, when pressed to account for themselves, reach for something, a shaping, a softening, a way of arranging the facts so they land more gently. She did none of that. She spoke the way a person speaks when they have stopped expecting their words to change how they are received. She had come from a small town in Ohio, she said. Her father had worked the rail yards. When he died, the work stopped and the house went with it, and there was nothing to stay for, and no particular reason to go in any direction except west, because west was what remained. She had picked up work where she could find it. A laundress here, a cook's helper there, a season at a boarding house that had more opinions about her than it had wages to offer. She had drifted through 2 territories before she arrived in this one, and she had answered the posting for seasonal ranch help because it named a wage and a roof, and those 2 things together were enough. She said all of it plainly, standing in the cold beside him, her wool shawl pulled close, her eyes on the middle distance. She did not apologize for any of it. She did not frame it as hardship to be pitied or resilience to be admired. It was simply what had happened, and she reported it the way a steady person reports the weather. He listened. The narrator would say, and it matters to say it, that this was not ordinary listening. He was a man who had spent 3 years conducting every conversation from behind a careful silence, measuring out words like something scarce, hearing people mostly as noise he was waiting to end. He had forgotten, without knowing he had forgotten, what it felt like to be genuinely interested in another person's account of themselves. But he was interested now. He stood with his arms loose at his sides and he listened to her speak, and something in him, some long-braced thing, eased a fraction. Not much, just enough to notice. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of a man with nothing to say, the silence of a man arranging himself around something new. "That's a long way to come," he said finally, "for a smokehouse job." The corner of her mouth moved, briefly, in something that was not quite a smile but lived in the same neighborhood. "It wasn't advertised as a smokehouse job," she said. He almost smiled then, almost. The cold held steady around them both, and the light from the house reached the yard in a long, warm band, and the distance between where they stood and where either of them had started seemed, for just that moment, shorter than it had any right to be. The night passed the way late autumn nights do in Montana, long and still and indifferent to the small lives burning beneath it. The stars were extraordinarily clear, the kind of clear that only comes when the cold has wrung every last particle of softness from the air. Inside the bunkhouse, the hands slept heavily, full for the first time in weeks. Inside the main house, the lamp in the front room burned for a long while before it finally went dark. She was up before the light, not because she had been asked to be, not because there was work assigned, but because she had learned, in the years before this one, that the worst time to be found unprepared was the moment someone decided you were no longer needed. Better to be ready. Better to have your things in order before the word came, so you could leave with your head still level and your dignity still whole. She folded what she had with the care of someone who owned very little and had learned to treat very little as though it were a great deal. The shawl last. She shook it out, smoothed it, set it on top. Her bundle was small enough to fit under one arm. It always was. She did not let herself think about the supper, about the table with the lamp burning warm across it, about the way the men had eaten with something other than mere hunger, with something closer to relief. About the moment she had looked up from the far end of the table and found the rancher watching her, not as an employer measures the utility of a hired hand, but as a man tries to memorize a thing he does not yet know he wants to keep. She did not let herself think about any of it, because she had thought about things like that before, and thought had a way of becoming hope, and hope had a way of making leaving harder than it needed to be. She heard him before she saw him, a single footstep on the threshold, careful, as though he had stopped himself from coming in and then come in anyway. She did not turn immediately. She finished smoothing the shawl. Then she turned. He stood in the doorway with the early gray light behind him and his hat in his hand, which meant he had put it on and taken it off again before he knocked, or perhaps never knocked at all. He looked at the bundle under her arm, at the shawl folded on top. His expression did something she could not quite name. It was not surprise, exactly, because some part of him must have known this was how the morning would find her. It was something closer to a man arriving somewhere he should have arrived sooner, and knowing it, and standing in the doorway of that knowledge with his hat in his hands. He did not move from the doorway right away. He stood there long enough that she understood he was choosing his words the way a careful man chooses footing on uncertain ground, not from calculation, but from the rare and uncomfortable desire to say something true. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, not low from diffidence, but from the particular restraint of a man who has spent 3 years saying very little and now finds himself with something that matters. He said that the ranch had been empty before she came. Not the smokehouse. The smokehouse was only a building. He meant the place itself, the yard, the table, the air inside the rooms. He had let it go empty, he said, because he had stopped seeing the point of filling it, and a man who cannot see the point of a thing will let it fall to ruin without quite meaning to. He had not known that until she set a ham on the supper table and his men looked up from their plates the way men look when they remember that a place is worth staying in. He stopped. He was not a man accustomed to speeches, and he seemed to know he had nearly reached the end of what he could say without losing the thread of it entirely. He said only, she had made him want to care for the place again, and that was not a small thing. That was, in fact, the only thing. She stood still for a moment after he finished, not from uncertainty, but from the simple need to feel the weight of what had just been offered, to hold it honestly, without hurry, before she answered it. Then she set the bundle down on the floor beside her. She did not lean it against the wall or set it on the bed where she might easily pick it up again. She set it on the floor, and that was its own kind of answer. She looked at him steadily and said she would stay. Not because she had nowhere to go, she had managed that far on her own and could have managed further, but because she recognized in him what she recognized in herself, a hunger not for comfort, but for a life that meant something. And she thought, standing in the gray morning light with her bundle at her feet and his coat still warm on her shoulders, that meaning something was worth the risk of choosing it. They did not say anything more that was important. They did not need to. Later that morning, after the hands had ridden out, they sat together at the long supper table with the lamp burning low between them. Outside, the smokehouse door stood open to the winter air, unhidden, unhurried, holding nothing back. Nothing worth having needed to stay hidden anymore.